Lately I've been browsing, treading water that they drowning. My head on a swivel, yeah. It's only really my surroundings.
Hello and welcome to episode 63 of the Smash Accept podcast. I'm your host, Michael Royer. You can find me on Twitter at dynasty_dadff. And we got a fun episode tonight. Last week we talked about, you guys that are in contention, who to buy. Got a lot of great feedback from that episode of, strength of schedule and some players you guys should be targeting. Today we're going to go on the opposite spectrum. Let's say you didn't start out the same way, or, you're a team that was been in the middle. We're going to tell you guys how to rebuild or possibly retool your team. And, I'm excited, Mung, because this is a topic that you and I have alluded to a couple of times. This is our third episode going over how to rebuild, but this isn't just going to be the how-to. It's going to be, who do we pick up? Who are the guys that we should be going out there getting, and what should we be targeting? So, Mung, I'm excited for tonight. How you been?
Yeah, pretty good. Just a busy couple weeks, but making it work. Of course, you guys can find me on Twitter at FFA_Mung. That's MENG. And I actually have been making some trades in some of my leagues where I've come to the conclusion that I am not a contender, sadly, this year, after whether it's down weeks and losing records or just injuries, of course, that we have no control over. But whatever it is, even if you're 5-5 after this past week, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're truly, going to the title game. So it's time to make those hard calls. And honestly, the hardest thing is being honest with yourself, right? Like, we all want to win the title every year, but that's simply not realistic.
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest thing when people come to me. Everybody wants to win, and we've talked about this before, where if you have 10 teams and 2 or 3 of them should be rebuilding, and potentially looking that way, or ones that are really going into contend. And I get a lot of people send me their rosters. They're like, this is what I look like. And sometimes I got to hit them up with it, because it's like, hey, if you go into a rebuild, and I'm going to let you guys know I did 3 rebuilds 2 years ago. All 3 of those teams right now are 9-1. And they're loaded with picks, and they're still set, and sometimes we try to hold on to teams for so long. And I'll be the first to admit, my Smash Accept Listener League team is like one where it's like, it's win now. And this is like 100% got to win now, because I do not have the youth. I do not have the picks. But we gotta look ourselves in the mirror and say, hey, is this time to make some trades? Do we need to, if, like you said, if I'm 5-5, or if you're 4-6, you should definitely be leaning that way. But check to see how your league looks. I mean, you could be 6-3, 6-4, and kind of pretending, and we got to look at those things closely, because it's better. I talk to FF Day Trader a lot. He's in Smash Accept Listener League too. A guy that's part of Smash Accept, and he's like, isn't it better to put yourself in that pick of 103, 104 than to be a pretender and squeak into the playoffs? We talk about it a lot. You want to be top 3 or bottom 3. You don't want to be stuck there in the middle, because all you're doing is just prolonging the inevitable. You're getting that 107, 108 every single year, and then you're pushing your rebuild back further and further.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it really depends on your leagues too, right? Because there are some good teams out there, but for their particular leagues, that there are 2 or 3 teams with just some superstar rosters that you don't think you can overcome in the playoffs. So whether it's trying to sneak in or, whether it's sneaking into the playoffs versus actually making it, 2-3 rounds close to the title game. You don't want to be the Seattle Seahawks, right? Where they make the playoffs every year and then they lose that first game, because really you're just costing yourself a better draft pick and just kind of muddling around in the middle.
Yeah. Or you could be the Rams and trade away all your picks, kind of go that route. But, first I want to talk about is retooling a little bit. So we talked about this a couple weeks back, where this has been a crazy season, like every season. There's been tons of injuries piled up, and there are opportunities now where you can get guys on the cheap. I have a lot of people asking me, what? This was a year where I felt like I was a team to beat. Most of my core is pretty young. What about going up and getting Derrick Henry? What about going up and getting, Cam Akers? What about getting some of these guys? And retooling is just very, it's a very fluid thing. You got to just look for, if you're missing one player, if you're missing one or two, what I suggest to people is this time of year, find that guy that really needs something. Find the Derrick Henry owner and offer him Damian Harris plus something and try to get a guy like Derrick Henry, where this time of year when people want to win, they're willing to overpay. They really do. And they want that running back. They want that shiny new toy. And you could easily get players that are way undervalued because they're not playing. And it's the same way on both sides. We're going to talk about it. We talked about James Conner last week, right? As a buy. He's also a major sell. So you got to look at where you are and who you're trying to trade with and know your league mates. I mean, we have that's rule number one when we talk about rebuilding and retooling is knowing your league mates. There's that one guy, he never leaves the season with his first round pick, right? We all know there's that guy who overpays for the running back that just hit. That guy who's going to pay a second for Deontay Foreman because he had 9 fantasy points this week. We all have those guys. So knowing your league mates this time of year is about as crucial as it gets.
Yeah, and speaking of running backs who could be win now pieces or rebuilding pieces, Saquon Barkley's value is really depressed right now. I mean, look at some of the recent trades that have gone down for him, where somebody gave up Barkley and a 2022 first for Zeke. Somebody got Barkley for Aaron Jones plus Jacoby Myers. I'm seeing deals like A.J. Dillon plus a first for Saquon Barkley for Darren Waller straight up. And really, I mean, I think we've talked about Barkley before on past shows, and it's that same mentality where it's out of sight, out of mind, right? He started the year a little bit slow, coming back from that ACL tear, and now he's missed a few weeks with the ankle sprain. But really, none of these are long-term concerns. They're not lingering issues, continuing soft tissue injuries like a Will Fuller type. I mean, Barkley's a monster when he gets on the field, and right now it sounds like that's going to be this week. So that buy low window might just be closing in the next few days.
Yeah, and I mean, the 2 weeks where Saquon was healthy, over 20 fantasy points both weeks. I mean, he is the kind of guy where you could look at him in either direction. There's a lot of people that have lost faith. I'm personally a big believer. I put a tweet out there today of, now we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but I am in first place in 3 leagues and I have the 101, because I've made some savvy moves with some guys here. And I said, who's a player that you would sell for the 101? And someone told me Saquon Barkley. They said I would clearly get rid of Saquon Barkley for next year's 101. And I'm like, whew, man, I should get out there and try to, I would take that in a heartbeat. Because next year's class, I asked 5 or 6 different analysts and I said, who's the 101? 3 of them had different answers, and we're not quite sure this class is going to quite be as dominant or anything like that. But one thing I've done over the last several years, and I found it is just, it really builds your rebuild faster. It makes your team better. Is sometimes assessing guys right now, right? We talked about being able to look in the mirror. Some people can't, right? That one team that's 4-6, he's still going all in. He's still thinking, you know what? I still got this, I'm only 2 games out. I think I can get this. Target those guys sometimes. I've in the past, what I've done is I've taken a wide receiver of similar type point stature. So right now, taking, if you look at where some of the players are at, maybe getting a Deebo Samuels plus for, a wide receiver is putting up the same kind of numbers. Like he's similar in points right now to a Chris Godwin, getting Deebo Samuel plus, trying to get those guys first round picks because they think they're still in it. You're keeping a similar type point value, right? And now is it crazy to say that you would give up Devontae Adams for Deebo in a first if that first is going to put itself somewhere in the top 3?
I mean, I would rank Samuel over Adams straight up at this point. So if you can get a first on top, that's a smash accept. But
I made a deal last week, and I was like, I told you about it. I dealt Ridley and a second for Deebo in a first, and I was like, all right. And I feel like there's still some skepticism about him, but he has literally gone out and just balled out. He's the wide receiver 3 right now, and I still think, I made an offer today on a contending team. I offered Hollywood Brown in 2 seconds for Deebo, and he goes, man, I wish I wasn't contending so I could take that trade. And I'm like, I don't feel like you should be contending if you want to make that trade.
Yeah, but again, you can't force people's hands, right? So really, you got to just target the teams that actually do think that they need to, stockpile pieces for the rest of the season. But again, I mean, target the players who haven't been producing, right? Everybody's high on the guys who have had some big games over the last couple of weeks, but now all of a sudden people are super down on Mike Williams and Cortland Sutton, two names who are producing, very big games earlier in the season, simply because we've seen teams kind of focus more on those players, and then also with the return of Jerry Jeudy. So those are players that I'm seeing deals for that you might be able to get for second round rookie picks right now.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because one thing I've noticed is some of my leagues I'm trying to sell guys, and then I realize I can't get anything for them. And then I'm like, wait a second. I got to think about this in my other leagues that I could probably get these guys much cheaper than what I'm assuming, right? There's certain players out there, like I was shopping Aaron Jones because of the injury, and some of the offers I was getting, I'm like, man, I might need to relook this in my other teams, right? He's out 1 to 2 weeks. He could be a guy that you buy on the cheap end, and really, I'm seeing people go way out and try to spend way too much on A.J. Dillon for the next 2 weeks, and they're just decreasing the value of Aaron Jones by just saying, well, he's out for a little bit and I need him right now. And everything's out of sight, out of mind, or what recency bias is going on, and people just lose sight because they want to get in the playoffs so bad.
Yeah, and really, there's no hard or fast rule, right? Every situation is kind of different. In general, we want wide receivers for rebuilds, but that's not always the case. I had somebody ask me about Hunter Renfrow, and that's not a piece that I'm looking to acquire for a rebuild, both due to his age and also his trade value is never going to reach a first, right? No. He could finish the year as a top 15 wide receiver in PPR, but no one's going to be excited to buy Hunter Renfrow for a first-round rookie pick. So you want assets that or at least think are going to increase in value in the coming year or so. Yeah,
and I had a guy send me one the other day. He goes, hey, I know you say you're rebuilding teams on wide receivers. And yes, that's true. But the guy said, well, he offered me this player plus either my choice of a late second or Darrell Henderson. And I was like, I told him I wanted the late second. I'm like, whoa. Henderson is worth so much more than the late second, because what you got to think about is being able to cascade that, right? Take the wide receiver he's going to give you, but then take Henderson and flip him for something else. There's just because you're in a rebuilding team doesn't mean you can't give up a second round pick for Henderson. Just because you're a rebuilding team doesn't mean you can't buy someone on the cheap, right? And we talk about it all the time. It's stock. You buy it on the cheap, you sell it there. Henderson is worth a first-round pick right now to so many teams, and we talked about him on our buy episode last week. And to the listener that we were talking about that, we worked through it, and he ended up getting Henderson. And now he's got an opportunity where he can at least flip Henderson and maybe a small piece and get himself a first-round pick instead of that second-round pick. Just because, you understand what I'm saying? Like, sometimes we look at all the players, and just because a player is sexy and fresh to you doesn't mean that someone else is or isn't to you, doesn't mean someone else in the league isn't going to be interested. And that's where we say know your league mates and try to understand where you can make those moves.
Yeah, and on the flip side, I mean, you can probably get some players whose name value is really low right now, right? I mean, you can get Trey Sermon for a third or fourth round rookie pick. People have really soured on him, and he's been a healthy scratch, so certainly not going to sniff the field anytime soon. But at the same time, he's an injury or two away from a big workload. We saw him get that a few weeks back. We know that Jeff Wilson Jr. is a free agent after this year, so really, the number 2 spot behind Mitchell is still open, especially with running backs and the injuries, or guys like Kenny Nwangwu, right? We don't know what the situation is with Dalvin Cook exactly. Right now, it does not sound like he's going to be suspended at all for the second half of this season, but we don't know how that situation is going to play out in the offseason. And obviously, Alexander Mattison is already highly valued, but this is a third-string running back who could very well see touches as soon as next year or earlier.
Yeah, the kid is explosive. Let's talk about Dalvin Cook a little bit, because I've seen him change hands in 3 leagues this week. And I feel like some people are hitting that panic mode. I've seen a lot of trades out there. I mean, I'm sure you have as well. Where are we sitting on that? How should teams? It sounds like he's going to, like you said, he's going to play out the remainder of the season for sure. So if you're a contender, I mean, I'm seeing people. I saw 2 trades. I'll have to pull them up here, but I believe one of them was Cordarrelle Patterson and a first, and another one I believe was Stephon Diggs and a second. And I'm like, Dalvin Cook is still there to win that championship for you. If you're a contending team, he does not feel like someone that you're trying to actively try to push off your roster.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the price because we know that leagues are very different when it comes to evaluating risk of suspension. But, just to reiterate again, as of right now, there's nothing that indicates that he's going to miss any time in 2021. Now, 2022 and beyond, that's, anyone's guess, really, at this point, considering how inconsistent the NFL is in doling out punishments or lack thereof. But yeah, I mean, certainly not panicking, not selling low on Cook, even if you're rebuilding. I think you let him continue to play for another couple weeks until this dies down a little bit. And if you can get him on the cheap for a contending team, then that's definitely a target I would consider.
Yeah, I mean, I just got a text 5 minutes before we jumped on here, and I'm 9-1. And my team's been fantastic all year, so I'm always reluctant to do tinkering when you're in that kind of position. But he offered me Dalvin and Thielen for Metcalf, Montgomery in a second, and I'm just like, ugh. It just feels so close, right? I mean, we talked about Montgomery possibly being a buy for the second half of the season. Metcalf's been up and down, but Russell Wilson, you feel like he's going to get back on track. And it was just like, I know before the season started, I would have been all over that. But at this point, I'm like, man, I hate tinkering with what I got.
Yeah, I mean, that's the age-old question, right? I mean, how much tinkering is too much? But at the same time, I would say don't be afraid to make some moves, even on teams where I am the number 1 or number 2 seed in the league. If someone offers me a good deal, I'll continue to look into those because, you have to, 1, plan for injuries, and 2, always get that value as long as you're not sacrificing wins in the short term.
Yeah, for sure. And pay attention to your trade deadline. I mean, a lot of teams have gone to no trade deadline at all. And in those kind of leagues, you don't want to make it too early, right? You don't want to be making those trades. And on the flip side, we've talked about it. If a guy's going to get you to that spot, if he's going to get you to that buy, it makes sense. So let's talk about rebuilding now. Okay. So we're in a spot. We're 4-6. We're 3-7. God forbid we're 2-8. 1-9. There's those guys in every league. It's time to start making some moves, right? And we need to do what we talk about in the rebuilding episode is creative positional deficiency, right? No one likes that guy who puts a bunch of it. I remember several years ago a guy putting Zeke and Saquon on his taxi squad because they were adding points to his roster. Nobody likes those kind of guys. We still want you to be competitive. What I've always preached is create that positional deficiency, right? So stock up on your wide receivers and not start running backs that are really doing much of anything, because they're the easiest piece to add on there. But what I try to do is really just build around those young wide receivers and start moving some pieces. So let's talk about some guys that we should be moving right now. At the wide receiver position, if you have Davante Adams, if you have, even Mike Evans, DeAndre Hopkins, Adam Thielen, Keenan Allen, we got to start thinking about moving these guys for sure. I feel like the older wide receivers can last a little bit longer, but in a good, legit rebuild, you're talking about a 2-year turnaround. You were going to say all these guys are going to be 30, 31 years old. Those are the guys that aren't going to be helping you win in 2 years. So those are the guys we should start thinking about moving. What you want to do is you want to move into some of those other guys. So if you're not in a spot to be winning right now, we talked about it last week, where guys are taking, Tyreek Hill's still in that same kind of area, and they're moving off Tyreek Hill to CeeDee Lamb plus a little bit. They're moving off Tyreek Hill even for Jamar Chase. Moves like that where you can take a guy and you can just move back just a little bit and add a little bit of value. Are there some guys that you are actively looking to acquire in that same kind of realm? We're talking about high end. You have one stud wide receiver left. Who are you trying to, move around and pick up?
Yeah, and really it's looking ahead to the offseason, right? Because it's not even necessarily all about age, because some of the names that you mentioned, Davante Adams, Mike Evans, these are guys who we don't necessarily know who their quarterback's going to be in 2022, right? We don't know what exactly the timeline is for Tom Brady. We all know he wants to play till he's 50, but will he actually, right? Especially if he can go out on top back to back. In terms of Davante Adams, it doesn't sound like he's going to be with the Packers, and it doesn't necessarily sound like Aaron Rodgers is going to be with the Packers. Now, could a team potentially sign both of them and reunite them? Yeah, it's a possibility, but I would say the odds are fairly low. So again, we just don't know. So coupled with the fact that their age is getting up there is the added uncertainty. Now, on the flip side, you want to target guys who have upside with uncertainty, right? So younger players like Cortland Sutton and Mike Williams, who I talked about, both of them are going to hit free agency. They have a chance to go to an offense where they could potentially capture a larger piece of the pie in terms of target volume. And really, you're looking at one, free agency coming up, and then two, the surrounding talent around them and whether any of those players are going to be hitting free agency.
Excellent point. I like that because in the past, that was not something I looked at as much about, changing quarterbacks or changing scenarios as much as I did age. And we have a lot of, potential uncertainty there with those kind of players. So I like that a lot, and you mentioned something, and I think it's the biggest thing here is trying to eliminate your risk, right? You're trying to, when you're rebuilding, you want to move off somebody. If you're going to move Tyreek Hill and he's your last player, and I did this 2 years ago with Davante Adams. I moved off Davante Adams for I forget, I think it was ended up getting like DK Metcalf in a first, and it was like, I believe that DK Metcalf was going to take that next elite jump. And there's some rookies right now and second-year guys that I think are really close to making that jump. I mean, Devonta Smith has had back-to-back 22-point performances. He's looked fantastic. We've talked about Jalen Waddle really ascending. Michael Pittman right now is the wide receiver 7. And there's some guys that are really making their way up the list. I mean, you're not going to be able to buy Jamar Chase. There's most leagues that's just not happening. But some of these guys still are not being caught up, right? They're not being evaluated the way they should be. And those are some guys that I think are really ascending in the right direction towards stardom.
Yeah, and again, you got to, like any other situation in life, you got to read the room, right?
Yeah.
Because I've sent out some good, strong offers for guys that you talked about, like Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, who we know are in that top 5 dynasty wide receiver conversation.
Yeah.
And the responses I've gotten back are, it's a fair deal. I just don't want to move that guy, right? And there's nothing you can do in that case. But we talked about Deebo Samuel. People still aren't fully believing in him. But he's a young guy who the only concern really is the soft tissue injuries that he's had in the past. But outside of that, he's clearly established himself as a talented wide receiver 1. Another guy, guys like CeeDee Lamb and DK Metcalf, their values are super high. No one's moving off of them except for big overpays. But Marquise Brown, we haven't seen enough of him for people to fully believe, but he's shown enough that if Baltimore continues passing more as they have this season, then he's a guy who could be in that top 5 wide receiver conversation, but is still being valued, like a top 15 guy instead.
Well, let's talk about Deebo here, because you and John were both saying he's a top 12 dynasty wide receiver, I believe 2 weeks ago, and I was not there yet. I was like in the 15 range. I mean, aside this past week, this is the only week he hasn't had 9 targets. He only had 5, but it was 5 for 5, 97, a touchdown, and then a rushing touchdown. He put up 30 fantasy points. I mean, his worst performance, he has 2. He has 1 at 10, 1 at 11, but everything else you look at is 30, 23, 21, 35, 32. I mean, Deebo looks ridiculous right now. He is almost 1,000 yards already, 54 receptions. How high should we be having him right now? If someone came to you and said, what do you need to add on top of Deebo Samuel to get Tyreek Hill? What would you be willing to sell for?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? Because he has had a history of soft tissue injuries, but it's really more, it's not that he's scoring points, it's more so how he's doing it. Because one, it's not really touchdown reliant. He's just been a yards after the catch machine. Mm-hmm. And two, the thing that really solidifies him as a top 10 dynasty wide receiver, I would say now, is that even with Kittle back the last 2 weeks, his target share and his production haven't really dipped all that much.
Yeah. That's been the big surprise to me. Is like, I was even saying to you guys 2 weeks ago, I was like, well, Kittle's coming back, it's going to change, right? Because that's what we've seen. Kittle's still eating and Deebo's eating. It's like they're both finally getting it, and it's, oh man, it's been fantastic if you guys had patience with both these guys on your fantasy roster.
Yeah, and I mean, another changing situation that doesn't rely on free agency is the ascendance of rookie quarterbacks, right? We haven't really seen Justin Fields fully break out. We've barely seen Trey Lance start any games. And these are offenses where, Chicago isn't a good example because Allen Robinson's going to be a free agent after the season. But Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, those are guys who could benefit potentially from a quarterback change either late in the year or in 2022 and beyond. So that's another thing to target. We've already seen that Mac Jones has shown that he's pro ready. And some of these guys, Zach Wilson, right? Corey Davis is super cheap right now. And I'm not necessarily a Corey Davis believer, but you have to look at the potential upside if some of these quarterbacks do end up putting it together.
So, big time fan of the show. I talk to him quite regularly. It's at New Jet City. And he was talking to me today about, he's like, I know you talk about insulating your trades. I know you talk about making some moves, buying low. He's like, I'm a contender right now, and my running back situation is very, he said right now he doesn't have an RB2, and he's really kind of desperate for it. He asked me, he goes, should I be trading if I can get Justin Fields and if I can get Javonte Williams or Antonio Gibson? Would you trade Kyler Murray for that? And I'm like, whew, this is tough, right? He wanted him to add to the Kyler Murray side, but I'm like, this seems like a situation here where Fields has looked good 2 weeks in a row. Is that a move you would make? And we kind of talked it back and forth because the other owner wanted him to add a first and Corey Davis on top, and I'm like, Kyler Murray is a premium asset, but if you can get Fields and Gibson or Fields and Williams, we're starting to really get in the right track where he's getting two up-and-coming pieces that could help him win now versus Kyler Murray. And it was tough, I told him, I was like, Kyler's a tough guy to trade, but are we getting close to that point where Justin Fields' ascension seems inevitable? It's been back-to-back weeks. He's looked great. We went through the growing pains. Are we going to go back with some bumps, or is it going to be a guy that can win you something down the stretch?
Yeah, it's definitely worth consideration, right? Because we've seen that Kyler Murray has had some injury issues and, nothing recurring, obviously, but at some point we are somewhat concerned that perhaps that he can't take as many hits as some of the bigger quarterbacks, right? And Russell Wilson has put together a career where he knows when to go down, when to slide, and all that, but he's still going to take some hits in the end. So that's just a risk factor that you take into account there. I think I would take Javonte Williams and Justin Fields. And I think Gibson and Williams are close in value, but I would take Williams in this case because for some reason his dynasty value it feels like people are already expecting him to be the next Saquon, even though we need to pump the brakes just a little bit and actually see what he does without Melvin Gordon in 2022.
I know he's RB25, and I know he's splitting carries, but he's already valued above the 101 for next year, and I put that poll out, and he won that poll, but then we're talking about other people saying, hey, let's just deal Saquon for the 101. I was like, if you have to choose between Javonte and Saquon, it's pretty easy for me, even though I'm starting to really come around on Javonte. So if you can make some moves like that, where you can take a player that you believe is going to be there. We believe Justin Fields could be in that Kyler Murray realm next year, or at least ascending that way. And then you add who we all believe to be, at least a solid RB2, if not an RB1 next year in Williams, and you're staying young. That's a win-win type of move. And if you guys can do that, that's not just rebuilding. He's doing that to win now, so it still works on both levels. The next thing I wanted to talk about is some more of these quarterbacks, right? These rookie quarterbacks, the value hasn't really hit a peak yet. So we have Trey Lance, Mac Jones, still the value isn't up there. Who are some guys in Superflex, if we're rebuilding, who are we looking to move off of and who are we looking to buy? What are the type of prices that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, people are really excited about Justin Fields and Mac Jones because we've seen them succeed in certain games, right? And people are really starting to write off Trevor Lawrence and Trey Lance just because we haven't seen it yet from them. And I know that it's hard to believe in Trevor Lawrence right now. Jacksonville just looks like an absolute mess. But at the same time, you didn't draft Trevor Lawrence with the 1.01 just to sell him for a 2022 first and second a few weeks later because the Jaguars don't look good, right? We expected that going into his rookie year. Now, obviously, I don't love that Urban Meyer is kind of in control of Trevor Lawrence's fate, but at the same time, I'm seeing deals where Trevor Lawrence in Superflex is getting traded for Cooper Kupp straight up, and he's getting traded for a 2023 first straight up. And again, it's just the fact that you didn't draft him to sell him low just a couple months after the fact, right? And then another guy, we simply haven't seen much of Trey Lance yet. But now, guys who are valued similarly a couple months ago, I saw a deal where somebody sold Trey Lance for Trey Lance plus a first for Justin Fields. And that's absolutely insane to me, where we just haven't seen anything from Trey Lance, but that doesn't mean that you're adding a first to get a rookie quarterback that we've seen a couple games out of.
Well, you and I were both just tagged in from @SportsENT. He put Austin Eckler for Trey Lance straight up in a rebuilding team. And, Twitter's completely on the Eckler side. I saw one today where it was the guy said he was looking to contend, so he dealt Trey Lance for Kirk Cousins. That is the type of trade that in 3 months, in 6 months, in 9 months, you are going to really be hurting. Like, I feel like that's the kind of move you make where you're like, yep, had to go get Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins' value is never going to go up again. Trey Lance's value could go through the roof, So it's like, make sure if you are dealing Trey Lance or Trevor Lawrence in these type of situations, pump the brakes, focus on it, send us the trades, think about it. Because if you're not upgrading in one of the top 6 quarterbacks, you're not going to win. One of the top 6 to 8 guys in Dynasty, if you're not taking those guys and adding to get to that trade is going to be something you'll probably regret in a year or two. And quarterbacks, the unfortunate thing about making trades with quarterbacks when they're that young is that can sting for a long time, right? I mean, both of those guys have the opportunity and have the skill set to be dominant in the league for 8-10 years.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say this, right? Winning titles is better than winning trades at the end of the day.
Oh, for sure.
And Kirk Cousins is one of those undervalued guys who has been producing. But again, you're not selling Lance for Cousins straight up, right? If you're getting Cousins in a first, that's something maybe I consider for a strong contender. But again, I mean, going back to the Austin Eckler trade that you mentioned, like in a year's time, I don't think you can get Trey Lance for Austin Eckler plus a first. It's just something that, if you're projecting further out. Now, obviously, guys like Zach Wilson and Trevor Lawrence and Trey Lance could flame out, right? We simply don't know at this point. But again, we're basing what we saw pre-NFL draft and then all the analysis that we've done prior to the 2021 season. And you're not going to write these guys off just because they either haven't seen playing time yet after a couple months, or they haven't looked good for the first half of their rookie year out of a potential 15-year career.
Yeah, I mean, we just got another one. I mean, they're hitting us up pretty good on these. Is optimistic Viking fan, another guy who's really been great in interacting in the space, said he's desperate for a quarterback in a Superflex league. He has the sickest wide receiver core of Jefferson, Chase, Lamb, Deontay, DJ Moore. And he's wondering if he traded DJ Moore out of this group, what kind of quarterback should he be targeting, in a potential, league-winning type scenario. And I feel like it is a guy like Kirk Cousins plus, right? I feel like you can still get Cousins plus for DJ Moore. You might be able to get Tannehill in that range. I mean, there's some guys where you're probably not going to be able to buy those young, sexy names, but a guy like Ryan Tannehill, since Derrick Henry has gone down, is someone who seems to be almost a lock for 20-plus points and could win you another championship.
Yeah, I mean, just look at Tannehill's schedule, too, down the stretch. Jacksonville in Week 14, fantasy playoffs, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, and Miami. None of those secondaries scare you right now. A lot of injuries in those secondaries. But even, other guys who aren't getting much hype, right? Derek Carr, he's been up and down with the whole, first Gruden and then Henry Ruggs, all the situations going on in Las Vegas, but he's been looking solid throughout despite all that. I know Matthew Stafford's had some down games, but again, he's a guy who, if Odell Beckham can integrate into this offense, even after the loss of Woods, he's a guy who can bounce back. He gets Seattle and Minnesota to start off the fantasy playoffs. Those aren't secondaries that scare you. And then Jalen Hurts, who's had a couple of down weeks, and people are starting to really get nervous about him after he put up a ton of garbage time production early in the season. But again, we talked about him, I think, last week, where Washington, Giants, and then Washington again in the fantasy playoffs. So, yeah, I mean, look, DJ Moore, certainly a good talent, but again, I mean, we had not seen pass games thrive under Cam Newton, and it sounds like he's going to be the quarterback for the back half of the season. So it's hard to see Moore's value going up anytime over the next month or two.
Yeah, curse you, Jalen Hurts, for actually playing good football. His QBR is 85, which is third best in the NFL over these last 3 weeks, but it's killed your fantasy value. We want that sloppiness and running around like crazy going again. And now he looked good against Denver. I watched the entire game, and there's a lot of guys like that where you can go out there because people aren't believing. I saw in one of my leagues, someone after Matthew Stafford's last game Monday night, they sold him on the cheap. They're like, oh, he's coming off, 18 points, 14 points. He's been struggling. And I saw a contending team sell Matthew Stafford for James Conner and Tua Tagovailoa. And I'm like, man, like that. I can't see it. I can't see giving up Matthew Stafford in that type of situation when his running backs were still fresh. And it's like, don't panic on some of these guys. Just be patient. Hit us up with the trades. We'll kind of keep going that way. The one thing that I want to talk about from rebuilding squads is, let's say you're completely out, right? The most important thing, we talked about eliminating risks, is making your team liquid, right? Like, what's the only thing that can't go down in dynasty value? It's rookie picks. So if you can get some picks and start eliminating some of that risk and starting to, add some first round picks and take guys like what I try to do, and we talked about it last week, is take James Conner and pair him with something else and get a first. Maybe James Conner, even if it's James Conner in a second, if you're 2-8 at this point and you give up James Conner and a late second to get a first, you're winning. If you can get a guy like, I've seen a trade recently where someone gave up Devonta Freeman in a late third to get a second round pick. If you can do that kind of consolidation and you can start getting rid of some of that dead weight, some of those guys that aren't going to help you in a year, aren't going to help you in 2 years, it's a win, because you're not only you're making your first round pick better by decreasing your points possible, by putting yourself in a positional deficiency, but you're also accumulating picks down the road that just become, like we said, we talk about it all the time, that is a movable asset, right? Not everybody likes James Conner, but everybody likes rookie picks.
Yeah, and that's situationally dependent too, right? Because if it's your third round rookie pick for next year,
it's
and
not
you
much of a
expect
movement.
that to be 301 or 302, and you're moving up to what's projected to be like the 211, then obviously you're not packaging up much there. You're moving up a few spots. But at the same time, right, you don't have to sell these guys on the cheap because that's the best offer that you've gotten this week, right? If that player has a big game this coming weekend, you can probably get a second for him instead of a third, depending on the player, depending on the situation. Guys like Tom Brady and Matthew Stafford, who've had a couple of down weeks, right? You don't have to sell them right now if you've got 2 or 3 more weeks before the trade deadline. You can wait for them to hopefully bounce back. And the same goes for any player, really, right? A.J. Dillon, right now, I'm trying to send him for first-round rookie picks. No one's biting yet. No. But if he looks really good against Minnesota this weekend, if the Aaron Jones team loses this week, right, all of a sudden the dynamic shifts just a little bit where maybe they consider that deal.
Yeah, and Dillon's a guy, if you can get any first for him, I'm doing it. I feel like that's definitely the move there. But I've had people reach out and be like, should I just do it for a second since I don't need him? No. Like, there's no point in just giving away for a second, because guess that's probably what you paid for him. You want a return on investment. You want to try to up that to a first round pick. It's where you can take someone where you have a lot less value or a lot less risk and a lot more value potentially coming back in. What I was trying to implement is like guys that, so, you said you're not in any rush to sell them, right? So let's say, the guy approaches you mid-second and James Conner for his first, and let's just say that's how it is, and you decline it. He goes down to injury. He doesn't do a lot for your team next year. Like we're talking about peak value kind of guys is where I was looking at a little bit. And I understand your side of it too. It's a lot of like, all these are give and take type moves. There's some things, they're all league dependent. They're all those kind of things. But you have to kind of look, and that's where winning is done. And that's where you can literally make some moves and try to do some things where I've even taken guys like Connor, and I've moved a late first for what somebody else thought was like they thought they were going to be one of the better teams, and ended up being like, I mean, if you asked right now, if I could get the 105 for 112 and James Conner, I would do that. I would take that to move up into that area, and I feel like you can make some moves just to try to make your team a little bit less risky and have a little bit more, liquid type value to it. And I understand your point completely as well.
Yeah, and again, right, we always say it's hard to project where rookie picks are going to end up, but now that we're 10 weeks into the season, we have a fairly good idea, right? There might be some shakeups, some upsets in the fantasy playoffs, but we generally have a fairly decent idea at this point of which teams are going to make the playoffs and which teams are bottom of the barrel. Now, a pick could be somewhere between 104 and 110, but at least we know the range of outcomes a little bit better more than halfway through the year.
Yeah, and you got to know your league settings. I mean, in some leagues, it's points possible for all the teams that don't make the playoffs, right? So that team that might have had a couple lucky weeks in there, and they're sitting at that 6-7 spot, and they're trying to get in, but you see that they're second lowest in points possible. That could be a move where it's like you make that trade, they don't make the playoffs, all of a sudden that becomes the 102. And I've done that before, where you're like, that guy really thinks he's going to make the playoffs and he's really pushing hard to do it. Making a move to go get that pick sometimes comes up huge, and that makes your rebuild go a little bit faster. The position, and I know you just did recently about this particular week, and you were talking about it, I believe, on your podcast about tight ends. I literally do that as one of my one of my last things to add when it comes to a rebuild. But there's definitely some names to add out there. There's some guys that could really give you a potential boost and could be some guys at that tight end position on your rebuild that could pan out maybe later this year or into next year. Are there some guys that stick out to you?
Yeah, and obviously, we've talked a lot at length about guys who've popped up this year, like Dan Arnold and Tyler Conklin. Those are guys who you're fine holding in a rebuild because you just don't know where the trajectory is going to go in 2022 and beyond. But a couple tight ends that I want to touch on. One, the other side of that Vikings coin, right? Irv Smith Jr., who people were super excited about prior to the season before he had that knee injury. And again, I was actually a Tyler Conklin believer, so I was never quite as high on Irv Smith as others. But at the same time, he is a better athletic specimen. We expect him to have a big role next year. And this is another, we simply don't know, right? It's kind of like Blake Jarwin coming back versus Dalton Schultz in 2021. And certainly Conklin could hold on to that starting job. That's something to consider. So you don't necessarily want to just try and sell Conklin for anything you can get. But at the same time, whereas Irv Smith was fetching an early second-round rookie pick before the season, before the injury, all of a sudden he's a guy that maybe you can get for a third-round rookie pick. Mm-hmm. I've seen him traded for $300 fab dollars. I've seen him traded for Darrell Williams and Tyler Higbee. So these are trades where, again, we don't know with Irv Smith what the injury looks like and whether he's going to regain that starting role. But his value has plummeted to the point where I'm willing to take a shot on him, considering the steep discount that you can now get. And then one other tight end who's pretty much free, available on the waiver wire in a lot of leagues right now, is Foster Moreau, right? We saw one great game out of him when Darren Waller missed earlier this season with an ankle injury. And obviously this is for deeper leagues or large bench formats, but Darren Waller is going to be 30 years old next year. The way that his contract is structured because of his prior off the field concerns, is he can be released for zero dead money after this season. And again, that's not likely considering how well he's played, but we don't know. John Gruden's gone. There's a lot of directions that the Raiders organization can go depending on how they finish out this season. Certainly hasn't looked great the last couple of games, losing to the Giants and now the Chiefs. So, again, a trade is also possible for Waller where Foster Moreau could be that lead tight end heading into 2022.
Yeah, and when I'm doing rebuilding teams, Irv Smith's the perfect guy. The other guy, I'm always trying to take flyers. I took flyers last year on Logan Thomas, several years ago on Darren Waller. Those guys that are, just take some shots, some guys that seem to have the athletic upside. Blake Jarwin was one of those guys. I was also in there. Dawson Knox was a guy that I was big on last year and then kind of faded a little bit. He obviously showed some flashes. You just want to have young lottery tickets in there, right? You don't, if you're on a rebuilding team, you're not there for Travis Kelce. You're not there for Zach Ertz. You're for those young upside guys. And the one guy that sticks out right now, and I know, some people are going to scoff at it, but he's a tight end 3 right now, and Mike Gesicki is still not valued anywhere near that, right? Mike Gesicki has a lot of up and down games. We talked about it from some of the other guys at different positions, but they just don't seem to have that same respect. But if you look at him this year, he only has one game under, we'll skip week 1 where he didn't score at all, but he has one game under 7 points. And when it comes to, tight ends in the fantasy position, and that's not in tight end premium, that's just regular, but we're looking at a guy who has a ton of upside, and he's only has 2 touchdowns on the season, and he's the tight end 3. Mike Gesicki's always been a guy with a high upside, and I feel like people just aren't buying in yet.
Yeah, I mean, he's another athlete where, some of the one-handed grabs that he makes over the middle of the field are absolutely
gorgeous.
Sick. The box score has been there for him this year, but even before that, the talent was pretty evident. And he's another guy who's hitting free agency after this season. So he could go to a team where he could potentially be the number 1 pass catching option, depending on what that wide receiver core looks like. I
mean, a guy like that, 6'6", 250, the way he moves, he has a very high ceiling. That is for sure. It's too late to buy Kyle Pitts. A guy in my league just says, "Hey, I'm shopping Kyle Pitts." Should we still give an opportunity? I offered him 2 firsts. He declined that pretty instantly. But I mean, there's some guys there. Kyle Pitts and Hawkinson. Hawkinson, definitely there's a buy window there after he just put up a goose egg. There's a lot of teams where like, I can't have that on my team. I need to make sure I have a guy a lot more stable floor. Are either of those guys you talked about this past week?
Yeah, definitely. Again, I mean, these are guys that are older, so age isn't necessarily, or at least Hawkinson is, not Pitts.
Yeah.
But again, you're looking more at the changing dynamic of their surroundings, right? Hawkinson right now, we know that Jared Goff is not a very good quarterback, but they're going to have an early draft pick next year. They could make moves in free agency. We expect that offense to be a lot more functional in 2022 and beyond. So again, Hawkinson might be up and down for the rest of the season, but going forward, we know that the talent is there. And then with Kyle Pitts, with Calvin Ridley currently out the last few games, defenses have really been focusing their coverage on him, so he hasn't been producing a whole lot. I talked about him as a sell in redraft, and I stand by that. But again, in Dynasty, when you're looking ahead, right, the ceiling is just sky high. We saw in those couple of games the true potential that you can get out of a guy like Kyle Pitts, who's a true receiving weapon. He's not in there to block.
Yeah, I mean, then that's what you want right there, and that's definitely it. A couple guys, if you had to go out there and you just had to buy someone, and there's a wide receiver that you believe, and we've done it every year where it's been like Metcalf was my guy, then Lamb was my guy. Who is that guy for you right now? If you could go out and buy him, excluding Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, you could buy one dynasty wide receiver. Who's that guy that you believe in enough that you would trade Tyreek Hill for, that you would trade Devontae Adams and move down and feel great about?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's talking about Jamar Chase. No one's talking about Jalen Waddle, who's taken just a couple picks behind him. Waddle's looked phenomenal. When you look at the box score, it's not there because, again, he's been playing with Jacoby Brissett for 5 games this year. And then, 2, the touchdowns just simply haven't been there because, again, with Brissett, we know that he's a check down machine. They're not going deep. But look at this. Waddle, 8.5 targets per game as a rookie, establishing himself as a number 1 wide receiver, 6 receptions per game. Again, when you look at the splits with Jacoby Brissett versus Tua, it's 10.9 PPR points per game with Brissett, 16.8 PPR in the 4 games that Tua played the majority of the game. Again, all 3 of his touchdowns came with Tua. It's just the fact that no one's talking about Waddle because the touchdowns haven't been there. We've seen those highlight reels with Jamar Chase, and we're just not getting as much hype on Waddle. It's deals that I've seen for Waddle right now: a 2022 first and Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Oh, geez.
Brandon Cooks straight up. Somebody asked me earlier today if they should sell for a late 2022 first, and my answer was absolutely not.
No way.
Waddle for Myles Gaskin and Leonard Fournette. I mean, it's crazy. Right now, I just saw a deal, DeAndre Hopkins for Waddle and a 2022 first and a 2023 second. If you're rebuilding, that's the exact type of trade.
Yeah. That is it. The bell hasn't come out for a while, but that is the type of move where, you know, we've talked about we talk about insulated trades all the time, but that's free money, right? That is literally playing with free money. Would you trade Hopkins straight up for, you know, if you're rebuilding, would you just straight up?
It depends. I think you can get more right now. I just don't think the masses are quite that high on Waddle, so I don't think you need to. So why sacrifice the value? But honestly, like I would sell Hopkins for Waddle in a second if it came to that. It's crazy because people are hyped on Devontae Smith. They're hyped on Elijah Moore after just a couple of games. Yeah. They love Rashad Bateman. And yeah, all these guys are talented, but no one's talking about Jalen Waddle, who's already stepped into a true number one role as a rookie. We know that Will Fuller and Devontae Parker haven't necessarily been healthy, so the target volume has partly been due to that. But regardless of the why, he's been producing even with, you know, as the focal point of opposing defenses.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Devonta Smith because he is the highest graded Pro Football Focus wide receiver over the last 4 weeks. He is someone that I'm definitely targeting before it just blows up. He's got 3 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. Coming off, you know, if Jalen Hurts was a lot more competent as a quarterback, I believe these numbers would be considerably higher. But he's shown some flashes. He's had a couple games over 7 receptions. You know, he's been efficient over the last couple of weeks. Another guy that I feel like is out there where get that insulated trade and trade for Devontae Smith plus, you know, and try to get those kind of moves. Cortland Sutton's in that range. You want to get that guy plus. You know, Darnell Mooney is still, we were debating up and down with him, but he has literally been Justin Fields' guy. You know, he's coming off back-to-back solid weeks here, put up 20 points in fantasy this past week before the bye, and I mean, I think he's looked fantastic, you know, so there's a lot of guys out there that you can definitely be making some moves for. Chase Claypool's out of sight, out of mind, right? He's had some rough games where people have forgotten about him. Elijah Moore is one that you brought up that I'm really starting to believe in. You know, like he has had 4 straight solid games. It's going to be a lot of negative game script, but his value has shot up incredibly. Like he was going to be a guy that I was like, hey, you got to go out and buy, but that value is almost seeming like it's a creeping up past what I'd be willing to pay.
Yeah, and another guy that you didn't mention, Rondale Moore, right? Yes. Because, again, dynasty leagues are a lot like the stock market where you have to time these trades, right? You're not buying Tesla close to $1,500. You know, you're getting it now at a slight discount, and that's how I feel about Rondale Moore because, again, I was never the highest on Moore coming out, but when you look at this Cardinals offense, right, AJ Green's there on a 1-year deal. Hopkins is getting up there in age. They've only used Moore primarily on screens and those trick plays thus far. People were buying for firsts plus a second after he had the massive game, right? Over 100 yards and the touchdown. He's done nothing the last 5 or 6 weeks. And now you can probably get him again for a second-round pick. And that's when you buy, not when his value is sky high.
Yeah. I mean, it's all about timing, and Kadarius Toney's a guy where like he had week 4 where he had 6 for 78, then he goes nuts week 5, right, 10 for 189, and I saw him getting bought in leagues for first round picks everywhere. You look at it since then, he hasn't even put up 13 fantasy points over the last 4 weeks. You know, it's like if you can sell at the right time, now all of a sudden, okay, now I can get him. You know, and you just got to play things right. And when it comes to rebounds, go back, listen to episode 2. You know, that one still is fantastic. And then episode, I believe, 43, where we talked about rebuilds. I mean, there is a clear-cut method on how to do this. And if you guys do it right, you're going to be in a position where you're going to own the first round. You know, in those 3 rebuilds I had 7 firsts in all of them. Guess what? It was 2020. So my teams look glorious. You know, like you get the right class. You get that 2023 class, you're going to get beefed up, and you're going to have a roster where you look at it and you're like, this is the type of team that, you know, I know Under the Helmet says they're going to be dominant for years, right? They're going to have a team that's going to win for the next decade. You can start piecing that together, making those moves, and putting together some of those rosters that you're like, this is an investment where I'm clearly going to win year in and year out.
Yeah, I know we're coming up on an hour here, but I mean, really, like outside of specific players, I just want to stress that again. Don't feel obligated like you have to make these deals just because you're 3-7 or 2-8, right? We know that in some leagues there is no trade deadline. In others, it's coming up in 2-3 weeks, but you have some leverage here. Just because you don't want an old player to retire on your squad, there's also going to be teams out there who might lose a player due to injury over the next couple of weeks, or who might feel differently if they take a loss this week. So, an example in one of my leagues, somebody was interested in Tom Brady in Superflex, right? They offered their 2023 first-round rookie pick, which is a fair offer. I countered with a first plus a second, and they said it was too much. So, a few days later, I waited, and then I sent Brady plus a third for the first and second after they had a down game from Matthew Stafford, and they accepted that. So, again, it's really just timing these trades, and then also knowing
Did you say you traded Tom Brady?
Yeah, I did on a rebuilding squad.
No, I'm just messing with you.
But yeah, I mean, again, it's just, being willing to let these negotiations play out sometimes, because we know that the dynasty landscape can change very quickly within a few days. I mean, look at Robert Woods, right? His value overnight is now even worth a first-round rookie pick.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think these kind of episodes are fun, right? Because we're kind of thinking about it, and they're all situational. I mean, trades are always situational, and that's why we have this podcast, and that's why we answer so many questions when you guys hit us up. So you just got to know who you're dealing with. Like sometimes you have trade offers from a guy where if you reject that and you send a counter, he's probably going to accept in 2 days. Or there's guys that feel stressed. You can tell in the group chats, they're like, I need this player. I need a running back, and you can kind of gauge those things and really start to, this is the time of year where you really start to add value to your team, right? The contenders, they get their guys to win their championships, but if you're not there, you can really start to add some value and put your team from bottom 3 to the middle, or the middle into a playoff team next year, just by being savvy here and being patient and getting the deals that you need. So, Mung, that was awesome. It was fun talking about rebuilds. Next week we'll be back on to how to win it, because we're going to get back to some trades. But I know you got a lot of things going, so why don't you tell everybody what you have?
Yeah, and real quick, we talked about trades all episode, right? But for the loyal listeners who've stuck around till the end, one last little nugget of advice: work the waiver wire.
Yes.
Even if you're in rebuild mode, right? There's a league where I know that a couple of dynasty GMs really value speed. And when guys burst for long touchdowns, I know I can flip them. So I added John Ross in a deep league, and I flipped him for a third-round rookie pick after he had that one game. Adrian Peterson, right? I don't think he's going to do much in Tennessee. I think Dante Foreman's who you want. But I still spent a lot of fad dollars to get Adrian Peterson on a couple of rebuilding teams. And with that one touchdown, flip him for a third, right? Sometimes teams don't believe in these old guys, these so-called washed guys. But then when they see them produce, all of a sudden that can change very quickly where you get something out of them.
Yeah, if you're paying attention to waiver wire this week, or last week, I picked up Wayne Gallman on 4 teams this week. I mean, there might be a situation where Wayne Gallman is worth, the third-round pick, or maybe slightly more. And you said Foreman, I picked him up, and I instantly got an offer for a third. Now I'm a contender, but I'm like, trying to work with that person now. I might use Foreman to upgrade one of my wide receivers or upgrade my tight end, So that's a great point as well. There's so many different things. I hear a lot of people are like, I didn't really check the waivers this week. I'm 2-8. Shame, man. Go out there and use that fab. It's not going to help you next year. I mean, some of them roll over, but for the most part,
trade it if you can.
Yeah.
Sometimes people need those fab dollars to get a guy that they really want, or they think maybe there's a handcuff out there. What was it? A couple of years ago, Kareem Hunt. After he got cut, all of a sudden, after that video leaked and the Chiefs cut him, I traded a lot of my fab dollars for a second-round rookie pick so that someone could grab both of the Chiefs backups in a league. So again, these are the trades that you have to time well, but can really just add value here and there. But, you know, if you guys have specific questions, you can find us on Twitter. I'm at FFA_Mung. That's MENG.
And I'm at Dynasty_DadFF. Thanks again for tuning in and enjoy the process.